David Mitchell slowly opened his eyes, feeling the weight of his body sinking into the sterile hospital sheets. The monotonous sound of the machines around him marked the rhythm of his foggy thoughts. The cold lights from the ceiling seemed to cut through the darkness in his mind, revealing only fragments of what had happened. The memory of the car accident was there, but blurry, like an old photograph faded by time. He tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through his body, forcing him to remain still. That's when he noticed the voices. They were low but close. At first, David couldn't make out what they were saying, but as he focused, the words began to take shape more clearly. "Everything will be resolved soon, Claire," said a male voice, cold and professional. David recognized the distant and controlled tone of the family lawyer. "As soon as he dies, you will have full access to the inheritance and the company. Luke is also prepared to take over leadership." David's heart raced, and the monitor beside the bed registered the change. He tried to control his breathing, not wanting to alert the people in the room that he was conscious. "I know, but we need to be careful," Claire responded, her voice laced with a cruel calmness that David had never noticed before. "He's more fragile than ever. It shouldn't take long, but I need everything to be done the right way. We can't raise any suspicion." David's blood ran cold. His wife, the woman he had shared years of his life with, was conspiring to kill him and take his fortune. He felt a mix of anger and terror, but he knew in that moment that he needed to think quickly. He couldn't reveal that he was conscious. Not yet. He needed to discover how deep this betrayal went. He closed his eyes, pretending to be unconscious, while Claire and the lawyer continued discussing the details of their plan. Every word he heard was like a dagger in his heart. But David knew he had to stay calm, carefully plan his next move. He was about to embark on the greatest challenge of his life, surviving and exposing those who swore to love and protect him. In the following days, David forced himself to remain in the illusion of a coma, while his mind stayed constantly alert. The conversations around him became his only connection to the truth, and he began to realize that the conspiracy was even deeper than he had imagined. Luke, his eldest son, was involved up to his neck. Luke's visits to the hospital, contrary to what David wanted to believe, were not out of genuine concern but pure ambition. One afternoon, as Claire and Luke discussed the next stage of the plan, David felt an almost unbearable pain in his soul. Claire, the woman he had loved unconditionally, was betraying his trust in the vilest way possible. And Luke, the son he had been so proud of, now revealed himself as a cold and calculating accomplice. However, in the midst of the darkness, there was a light. Mary, his younger daughter, came every day, holding his hand, talking about how much she missed him at home and how everyone was hoping for his recovery. David sensed genuine affection in her voice, but even so, he was torn. Could he trust her? Or was she just playing her part in Claire's diabolical scheme? The days passed slowly, each visit becoming a new test of patience and endurance. David knew he couldn't pretend forever. At some point, he would have to act, but not before being sure who was on his side and who was his enemy. Over time, he realized that the moment to expose Claire and Luke was approaching, but for that, he needed irrefutable proof. David decided then that he would start recording everything. Every conversation, every word exchanged between Claire and the lawyer, or between Luke and the other conspirators, would be used against them. His plan was clear: gather enough evidence while feigning incapacity, and then, at the right moment, reveal everything and ensure that those who betrayed his trust paid the price. He didn't know how it would all end, but one thing was certain. David Mitchell would not allow his own family to destroy him without a fight. David continued his charade, pretending to be unconscious while carefully observing and listening to everything around him. Claire and Luke, confident that he was trapped in his vegetative state, began to lower their guard, speaking openly about their plans. Every word exchanged was a knife that cut deeper into David, but he knew he had to endure it. The time to act had not yet come. Claire visited David every day, but her visits were mechanical, devoid of any genuine affection. She spoke in a low tone, her voice a mix of impatience and calculation. Luke, on the other hand, was more direct. He wanted to know about the assets, the bank accounts, the investments. His ambition seemed boundless, and that hurt David in a way he never imagined possible. However, there was one person who seemed to be on the sidelines of all this. Mary. David's younger daughter was a young woman with a pure spirit and an open heart. Her visits were different. She entered the hospital room with a sparkle in her eyes, holding David's hand with affection and talking about simple but comforting things. She talked about how her classes were going, how much she missed their conversations, and how she believed he would get better soon. David wondered if Mary was truly unaware of everything or if she was just a talented actress, like her mother. The doubt gnawed at his heart, but he clung to the hope that Mary was the one person he could still trust. If that was true, she could be his ally, but if he was wrong, it would be his end. With each of Mary's visits, David searched for signs, anything that would reveal his daughter's true intentions. He noticed the small expressions on her face, the tone of her voice, the way her eyes seemed to shine when she talked about the family. Nothing about her seemed false, but David knew appearances could be deceiving. Despite the pain of distrusting his own daughter, David knew he couldn't be swayed by the desire to believe in something good. He had to be prepared for the worst, because Claire and Luke had already shown that blood ties weren't enough to guarantee loyalty. But as he watched Mary, a seed of hope began to grow in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone. One afternoon, while Claire was discussing details about documents with the lawyer, something caught David's attention. He heard Claire mention a crucial document that needed to be finalized soon. Her tone was urgent, almost desperate, and David knew that this document was the key to understanding the entire plan. Pretending to be still deeply unconscious, David focused on every word. Claire and the lawyer spoke in codes, but with David's heightened attention, he managed to grasp the essentials. The document in question was related to a financial restructuring that would favor Claire and Luke, ensuring that they would take full control of the assets as soon as he was declared dead. David knew he needed more than just to hear those conversations. He needed evidence. Determined, he began to devise a plan to record everything that happened in the room. He remembered the cell phone that one of the doctors had left in the room, in case any nurse needed to communicate urgently. That would be his first step. He needed the phone to start recording the conversations. The challenge was how to get the phone without arousing suspicion. He couldn't just wake up and grab the device. That would reveal that he was conscious. However, he noticed that the phone was always left on the same table beside his bed, but just out of reach of any subtle movement. One night, when the hospital was quieter and the visits had ended, David pushed himself to the limit to stretch his arm. The pain shot through his body like an electric wave, but he managed to reach the phone. Breathing heavily, he adjusted it to start a continuous recording. Now, he was ready to begin gathering the evidence he needed to expose his wife and son. But there was another issue that deeply troubled him. If Claire and Luke were so sure that he would die soon, what else could they be planning? That doubt hammered in David's mind, driving him to be even more cautious. He knew he was in a race against time. Every new piece of information obtained was an important part of the puzzle, and he had to gather them all before it was too late. The first clue was in his hands. Now, it was only a matter of time before he could use everything he knew to turn the game in his favor. With the cell phone now strategically positioned to record, David began collecting the necessary evidence. But he knew he needed more than just recordings to defeat Claire and Luke. He needed someone he could trust within the hospital, someone who could help him move without raising suspicion. And that's when an old family friend came into play. Mary Santos, an experienced nurse and longtime friend of David and his family, began making her regular rounds in his room. David had always trusted Mary, but now he found himself in a position where trusting someone could mean the difference between life and death. He watched closely how Mary cared for him, noticing that she always made sure to talk to him, even believing that he was unconscious. One night, when the hospital was silent and darkness filled the room, David decided to take a risk. With great effort, he squeezed Mary's hand when she was adjusting the sheets. The gesture was weak but enough to catch her attention. Mary stopped, her gaze fixed on David's face, and saw something in his eyes that made her realize he was conscious. She leaned in closer, whispering, "David, can you hear me?" When he squeezed her hand again, her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh my God, you're awake." David, his voice barely audible due to weakness, whispered back, "I need your help. They're trying to kill me." Mary, though shocked, remained calm. She knew the situation was serious and that any misstep could alert Claire or Luke. "I'll help you, David, but we have to be extremely careful. We can't let them know you're awake." They quickly formulated a plan. Mary would help David gather more evidence, using her night rounds to adjust the phone, ensuring that all important conversations were recorded. Additionally, she would use her position in the hospital to keep an eye on Claire and Luke, trying to discover if there were more people involved in the conspiracy. Mary also began to observe the doctors who were treating David. She noticed that one of them seemed very close to Claire, which made her suspect that he might be being bribed. This doctor, Dr. Roberts, had direct access to David's medical records and could easily manipulate the information to support the claim that David was in an irreversible vegetative state. David knew they had to be meticulous. A mistake could cost him his life. But with Mary by his side, he felt he had a chance. He was no longer alone in this battle. With Mary as his ally, David began to put his plan into action. They decided that the best way to expose Claire and Luke would be to record a conversation in which both explicitly admitted their plans. The previous recordings were useful, but they needed something more direct and undeniable. David suggested that Mary create a situation where Claire and Luke would feel compelled to speak openly about their plans. Mary, using her position in the hospital, informed Claire that the doctors were discussing the possibility of moving David to a palliative care unit, which would expedite the process of declaring legal death. The news unsettled Claire. During a visit, she and Luke began discussing the implications of such a move. "We need to resolve this soon," Claire whispered, believing that David couldn't hear her. "If they move him to palliative care, everything we've planned could happen faster. But we must ensure that there's no doubt about his death." Luke, always practical, responded, "We have Dr. Roberts on our side. He'll make sure the medical reports are exactly what we need. As soon as they move him, we can proceed with the plan without any issues." David, listening to everything, felt a mix of anger and determination. He knew he was getting closer to the moment when he could confront them. But the time wasn't right yet. They needed to be even more explicit, more careless. And for that, David and Mary would have to increase the pressure. The next night, Mary brought a new medical report showing minimal improvement in David's condition. She handed the report to Claire and Luke, suggesting that if there was more improvement, it might be difficult to justify the move to palliative care. This sparked a new debate between Claire and Luke, who now felt pressured to accelerate their plans. Claire decided that she would speak to Dr. Roberts the next day to adjust the reports, ensuring that David was moved immediately. Once again, David recorded everything. With each new recording, David got closer to the moment when he could expose Claire and Luke. But he knew he couldn't act yet. He needed one final piece of evidence, something that would leave no doubt about Claire and Luke's guilt. And he had an idea of how to get it. Days passed, and David continued gathering evidence with Mary's help. The tension in the hospital was palpable. Claire and Luke, unaware that they were being monitored, acted with increasing impatience. The recordings already contained incriminating information, but David needed a final piece to complete the puzzle, a confession that was irrefutable. David and Mary devised a plan to force Claire and Luke to expose all the details of their plans in one definitive conversation. Mary suggested that, during Claire's next visit, she mention an urgent meeting with Dr. Roberts about David's delicate situation. This, they hoped, would provoke a more direct reaction and, hopefully, an explicit confession. When Claire arrived at the hospital that afternoon, Mary approached her at the entrance. "Mrs. Claire," she began, with a serious expression, "Dr. Roberts needs to speak with you and Luke urgently. He said it's about the next step regarding your husband." Claire frowned, worried, and called Luke to join her in Dr. Roberts' office. However, before going, they decided to discuss privately the details of what they would do next. right there in the seldom-used hallway. "Luke, we need to make sure Dr. Roberts does what we agreed," Claire said, looking around to ensure no one was listening. "We can't leave anything to chance. If he doesn't issue the death certificate quickly enough, we risk losing everything." Luke, visibly nervous, nodded. "I know. I'll talk to him personally. We need to get rid of David before anything gets out of control." Mary, who was close enough to hear the conversation, discreetly signaled to David, who was waiting anxiously in the room, that everything was going according to plan. The recording was capturing every word, every detail that David needed. Claire and Luke continued talking, now more openly, detailing how Dr. Roberts was supposed to manipulate the medical records to make David's death appear natural. They also mentioned how they planned to divide David's fortune, with Claire taking the largest share and Luke assuming leadership of the company. It was the final proof David needed. He now had enough to ensure that Claire and Luke would be held accountable for their crimes. However, the success of the plan depended on a final confrontation, where David would reveal that he knew everything and, hopefully, where Claire and Luke would admit their actions in front of witnesses. But before David could put his plan into action, he knew he needed to prepare for the confrontation. The stakes were high, and a mistake could cost him his life. Nevertheless, he was determined. Claire and Luke could not get away with this. The moment David had been waiting for finally arrived. With the evidence in hand and Mary's support secured, he knew he was ready to confront Claire and Luke. That night, he asked Mary to summon Claire and Luke to the hospital under the pretext of a severe medical emergency. He knew this would force them to gather quickly, without time to plan or think about their actions. When Claire and Luke arrived at the hospital, they were immediately brought to David's room, where they found him sitting up in bed, eyes fixed on them. The shock on both their faces was evident. They hadn't expected to see him conscious, much less sitting up and waiting for them. "David," Claire stammered, her voice full of disbelief. You're conscious?" "Yes, Claire," David responded, his voice firm but laced with restrained anger. "I've been conscious the whole time, and I've heard everything, every word of your conversations about killing me, about stealing my fortune, about betraying the man you should have loved." Luke took a step back, his expression shifting from surprise to panic. "That's not what it seems, Dad. We were only—" "It's no use trying to lie, Luke," David interrupted. "I've recorded everything, every word. And now, both of you will pay for what you've done." Claire, realizing they were cornered, played her last card. "David, dear, you're confused. You were sick, weak. We just wanted to make sure you were well cared for, that your finances were in order." "Enough, Claire," David exploded, struggling to his feet. "I heard you planning my death, discussing how to manipulate the doctors, how to divide my fortune. You two are not just traitors, you're potential murderers. And I won't let you get away with it." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and 2 hospital guards, accompanied by Mary, entered. "These men have heard your confession," David said, pointing to the guards. "And there are more recordings on this phone. There's no escape." Luke tried to flee, but the guards quickly restrained him. Claire, seeing no way out, fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "David, please, forgive me. I did it all out of fear, out of insecurity. We didn't really want to hurt you." David looked at her, his heart heavy but resolute. "You made your choice, Claire, and now you'll face the consequences." As Claire and Luke were led away by the guards, David felt a mix of relief and sadness. He had won, but the cost had been high. His family was destroyed, and the trust he once had in his wife and son was completely shattered. But there was one thing he knew: Mary. She was the only person who had stayed by his side, the only one he knew he could trust. And now, with Claire and Luke out of the picture, David needed to rebuild his life, perhaps alongside the one person who proved to be true. With Claire and Luke finally exposed and taken away by security, David felt the weight of the battle finally lift from his shoulders. However, he knew that the wounds opened during this process would take a long time to heal, and some might never heal completely. Claire and Luke would now face justice, But David still had to deal with the emotional and practical repercussions of everything that had happened. Mary, his daughter, entered the room shortly after the commotion. Her eyes were filled with questions, mixed with pain and confusion. She had discovered, in those final moments, the true nature of her mother and brother, and it devastated her. "Dad," Mary began, but her voice faltered. She didn't know how to express the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. David looked at her with sadness and compassion. He knew Mary was dealing with a deep betrayal, something that would mark her for the rest of her life. He called her to come closer, and she did so cautiously, as if she wasn't sure if what was happening was real. "I'm sorry for everything, Mary," David said, his voice full of sincerity. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening, for allowing your mother and brother to reach this point, and I'm sorry you have to carry this burden." Mary began to cry, and David embraced her. For the first time since the beginning of this ordeal, he allowed his own tears to fall. He knew that the relationship between them would never be the same, but he was determined to do everything possible to repair what could be repaired. "I'm going to sell the company, Mary," David continued, after a few moments of silence. "I can't stay in that world, with the memories of what almost happened. I want to start over. Maybe the two of us can start over together." Mary looked at him, surprised, but also relieved. "Start over? How?" "We're going to leave all this behind," David replied. "We're going to start a new life, far from this city, far from the painful memories. We can find a place where we can be happy again, where we can heal these wounds." Mary slowly nodded, and David knew she was willing to try. This was the first step toward recovery, and he was willing to make all the necessary sacrifices to ensure she had a chance to be happy. As they embraced, David felt that, despite everything, there was still hope. He had lost a lot, but he still had the most important thing: a chance at redemption and to build a better future for himself and Mary. The days that followed were full of changes. David took the necessary steps to distance himself from the company, selling his shares and cutting all ties with the corporate world he had helped build. The media were relentless in covering the scandal involving Claire and Luke, but David stood firm in his decision to walk away from it all. He and Mary began planning their new life. David found a small coastal town, far from the hustle and bustle and painful memories, where they could start fresh. The transition was difficult, filled with emotional challenges, but it also brought a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. The sale of the company brought in a large sum of money, but David realized that what he valued most now was not money, but the tranquility and reconnection with his daughter. He used part of the money to buy a simple but cozy house with a view of the ocean. There, he and Mary began to build a new routine, free from the shadows of the past. Mary, little by little, started to resume her life. She found a local college where she could continue her studies and began making new friends, people who had no connection to the turbulent past of her family. She and David spent long afternoons talking, sharing stories and feelings that previously had no place in their busy lives filled with secrets. Time passed, and with it the scars began to heal. David still thought about Claire and Luke, but over time, the pain and anger were replaced by a quiet resignation. He knew he had done what was necessary to protect himself and Mary, and that gave him peace. One evening, as they watched the sunset together, Mary turned to her father and smiled. "Thank you for everything, Dad. I know it wasn't easy, but I'm happy that we're here, together." David returned her smile, feeling a warmth in his heart that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm happy too, Mary. I don't know what the future holds, but I know we'll face it together. And that's what matters most." As the sun disappeared on the horizon, David felt that he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. He had made the necessary sacrifices, faced the demons of the past, and now he was ready to embrace the future with his daughter by his side. And so, David and Mary began their new chapter, leaving behind the weight of betrayals and rebuilding their lives in a journey of redemption and hope.